The distress signal had been cycling for 11 hours before anyone on the Tenochtitlan station picked it up, and by then Dr. Reina Vasquez had already killed 3 of them with a rock sample chisel and barricaded herself behind a portable airlock door she'd unbolted from the expedition crawler. The signal was simple, not the automated kind that beacons broadcast when hull pressure drops below threshold, not the algorithmic SOS that the Martian Colonial Authority required every survey team to transmit upon confirmed first contact. This was a voice, her voice, 11 words repeated without variation, in the specific cadence of a woman who had calculated exactly how many options she had left and come up with one. "I need El Macho. Tell him it's Reina. He'll come." Commander Ibanez of the station played it twice before he understood what she was asking him to do, and then he played it a 3rd time, just to be certain he hadn't misheard the name. He had not misheard it. He sat back in his chair and stared at the moisture-beaded wall of the comms bay and felt the particular weight of a man who has been handed someone else's impossible problem. "Get me a tight beam to Earth," he said. "I need the Wrestling Federation's emergency contact line." The technician beside him didn't ask questions. Nobody on Mars asked questions anymore. Not since the dig at Meridiani Plateau had cracked open the permafrost and released something that the scientific community was still arguing about the correct taxonomic classification for, though the working field term, the one the survey crews actually used, was considerably less formal. They called them the parkas. 300 kilometers south of the station, in the field camp that had ceased being a field camp approximately 18 hours earlier and was now a defensive perimeter with a floor plan measured in meters, Reina pressed her back against the airlock door and listened. The listening was the worst part, not the attacks. The attacks had a rhythm you could learn, a telegraph that arrived approximately 40 seconds before contact in the form of a low harmonic pressure, something below hearing but registering in the sternum like a plucked wire. Not the smell, which was iron-cold and ancient. The smell of something that had been sealed into frozen rock for so long that the world it remembered no longer existed. Not even the sight of them, which was bad enough. 7 feet of desiccated mass wrapped in what had once been thermal gear, the kind of insulated parka that humans had been manufacturing in the same basic configuration for 300 years, now fused to bodies that had been dead long enough that the distinction between the garment and the wearer had ceased to be meaningful. No, the worst part was the silence between the attacks. The way they waited outside in the thin Martian dark with a patience that had no bottom to it, patient the way geology is patient, patient the way ice is patient, patient because they had already waited 80,000 years and a few more hours made no difference to them at all. She had 14 hours of oxygen left. She had the chisel. She had 2 protein bars and a thermos of coffee. She was rationing with the discipline of a woman who had written her doctoral thesis on resource management in long-duration isolated environments, which struck her now, pressing her shoulder blades against cold metal and listening to the nothing outside, as the single most useful thing she had ever done with her academic career. She thought about Miguel. She hadn't let herself think about him until now, keeping him in reserve, she supposed. The way she rationed the coffee. Not a crutch, a destination. Something to orient toward when the math stopped being solvable any other way. Miguel Angel Reyes, 23 years into the top tier of the Lucha Libre circuit, undefeated in singles competition for the last 9 of those years, known professionally by a name she had given him as a joke during a conversation they'd had after his 3rd championship defense. When she'd told him, he fought like he was personally offended by the concept of losing, and he'd laughed and said that sounded about right. She'd called him El Macho as a joke. He'd put it on the mask within the week. She pressed her palm flat against the door and felt the vibration on the other side. Not the harmonic precursor, just wind. Just the 300 kilometers per hour of dust-carrying Martian atmosphere doing what it always did. Just weather.
"Come on, Miguel,"
she said, to the door, to the dark, to the 45 minutes of signal delay between this point on the surface and the nearest relay satellite. "Be stubborn about it. You're good at stubborn." He got the message in a locker room in Guadalajara at 2:47 in the morning, still in the mask, 40 minutes after his defense of the Continental title against a challenger who had trained specifically to counter his left side clinch and had still, in the end, spent the last 4 minutes of the match looking up at the ceiling lights while El Macho held his wrist in the air. He read it twice. Then he sat down on the bench and held the phone in both hands and read it a third time the way Ibanez had played the recording. Not because he thought the words would change, but because he needed a moment to translate what was being asked of him into something he could say yes to. Mars. She was on Mars, and she was in trouble, and she had asked for him, specifically because she had run out of everything else. He was aware, in a distant way, of the other wrestlers in the room. The conversations dying out one by one as they registered his stillness. Miguel was not a still man. Miguel occupied space the way a current occupies a river, moving, adjusting, filling whatever shape the moment required. When he went still, people noticed. "Bad news," said Perro, his trainer, from across the room. "I need the earliest available launch window," Miguel said, "and someone who can brief me on what a Canadian mummy actually is." Perro looked at him for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a flask and set it on the bench between them. "Sit down," he said. "I'll explain what I know. It isn't much." What Perro knew turned out to be more than Miguel had expected and less than he needed. The colonial authority briefings he received during the 38-hour transit were more comprehensive, but raised approximately as many questions as they answered, which was the epistemic condition that the entire scientific community had been living in since the Meridiani discovery. The Parcas, formerly the Meridiani Pleistocene remains, a designation that the people who had actually encountered them found deeply insufficient, had been sealed in permafrost at a depth of 60 meters. The expedition that found them, which Reyna had been leading, had been a standard survey operation. Core sampling, geological mapping, the routine work of filling in the atlas of a planet that humans had been studying for decades, but only walking on for 40 years. There had been no reason to expect what was in the ice. There had been, as far as anyone could tell, no signs, until there were. The lead xenobiologist on the Colonial Authority Review Board had described the awakening as consistent with a triggered dormancy response, which was a careful scientific way of saying that whatever these things were, they had been waiting, and something about the drilling had woken them up. The ice around the cores had fractured in a specific pattern. The survey sensors had picked up a temperature differential before anything visible happened, and then the first of them had simply stood up out of the ice, like it was something it did every morning, shook the permafrost off its parka, and turned its head toward the nearest human being. The report described what happened next in clinical language. Miguel read the clinical language 3 times and still felt the cold of it settling into his chest. 48 hours later, he was on the surface of Mars in a borrowed encounter suit, riding a crawler toward the edge of Reyna's signal, and thinking very carefully about what he knew and what he didn't. What he knew, Reyna was alive. The signal had updated 6 hours ago. 14 hours of oxygen had become 8 hours of oxygen, which told him she was conserving, which told him she was calm, which told him she was herself. What he didn't know, how many parkas were outside the perimeter she'd established, what they responded to, what they wanted, what they'd been before they were whatever they were now, what he suspected. They were patient in a way that most threats weren't, and patience was a form of intelligence, and intelligence meant there was something you could communicate with if you could find the right channel. He'd built his entire career on finding the right channel, on learning an opponent's rhythm so precisely that he could tell, 3 moves before the move happened, exactly where the gap would open. He watched the crawler's sensors as the camp came into range. 7 signatures outside the airlock, arranged not randomly but in a specific configuration, a rough half circle with its open end pointing away from the Martian wind and toward the door, not besieging it, waiting outside it. He thought about that for the rest of the approach. He left the crawler a quarter kilometer out and walked. This was not, strictly speaking, the approach the Colonial Authority's emergency protocol recommended. The protocol recommended arm support, perimeter drones, a staged advance with redundant extraction options. Miguel had read the protocol and found it thorough and well-reasoned and geographically impractical, given that the nearest armed support was 200 kilometers away, and the perimeter drones had been in the supply requisition queue for 8 months. So he walked. The suit's external sensors picked up the harmonic pressure at 300 meters. The same low vibration the survivor reports described, the same chest resonance that Reyna had learned to read as a 40-second warning. Miguel noted it and kept walking, adjusting his gait slightly, distributing his weight differently, a thing he'd learned to do in the ring when the crowd's noise changed register. When the energy shifted from excitement to something more focused, you changed how you moved through the space. You didn't slow down. You just walked like you expected to be there. At 200 meters, the nearest parka turned. It was taller than the reports had suggested, or maybe it was the flat Martian light that made it seem that way, the way objects in low-contrast environments resolve larger than they are. The parka it wore had been red once, the thermal orange of a survey suit, but cold and time had bled it to a color between rust and shadow. Its face, where the hood framed it, was a preserved landscape of something that had once been human in the rough biographical sense. Same basic architecture, same orbital spacing, same jaw. But the eyes were wrong. Too deep, too still, the kind of stillness you find in amber, in ice, in things that stopped moving a very long time ago and learned to be patient about it. Miguel stopped. He'd had a conversation, once, with an opponent who had beaten him in his 6th professional year. One of the only men who ever had. He'd asked him afterward what he saw when he looked at Miguel across the ring, what the tell was, what gave him the read. The man had thought about it for a long time before answering. "You fight like you're trying to convince yourself," the man had said. "Most guys, they fight scared, or they fight angry. You fight like you're arguing, like you need the other person to admit something before you'll let it be over." Miguel had spent years deciding whether that was a weakness. He'd eventually decided it was a methodology. He stood in the Martian dust in a borrowed encounter suit with 7 ancient impossible things arranged in a patient half-circle 40 meters in front of him, and he held very still. And he waited to see what they would do with a human being who wasn't running. The nearest one made a sound. It wasn't language. It wasn't quite anything the suit's audio sensors had a category for. Not a vocalization, not a mechanical process, something in between, like the sound a glacier makes when it shifts, like the resonance of stone under pressure. But it was directed. It was unmistakably aimed at him. Miguel held still and let it wash over him. Then, because it was the only thing he could think of to do, he nodded. The parka went still. The half-circle went still. The harmonic pressure dropped 3 notches on the suit's sensors, not gone but diminished, like a hand easing off a string rather than releasing it entirely. Miguel breathed. He started walking again. The door opened on the 3rd knock pattern. 212, the rhythm of a song Reina's mother had sung, a thing they had established as a code when he had been 24 and she had been 22. And they had both thought the future was a country you moved to when you were ready, not something you built in real time out of whatever was at hand. She looked at him through the gap in the airlock, the way you look at something you calculate the odds on and decided to bet on anyway, and found out you were right, and the rightness of it is bigger than you had room for. "You're late," she said. "Traffic," he said. She looked past him at the parkas, standing at their patient distance in the Martian morning. Her expression changed, not fear. She was past the acute phase of fear, had metabolized it into something harder and more useful, but assessment. The scientific reflex. Reading data. "They didn't stop you. They let me through." "Why? I don't know yet." He stepped inside. "How many protein bars do you have left?" "I have coffee." "Good. We have time." She looked at him. "Miguel, we don't have time. My oxygen. Your suit can recharge from the crawler's reserves. I parked a 1/4 kilometer north. We have time." He took off his helmet and set it on a crate and looked at her properly, taking inventory the way he always did after a long absence, accounting for what had changed, what hadn't, what needed attention. She was thin in the way that people get when they've been rationing and not sleeping. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were the same as always. "Tell me everything you know about them," he said. "From the beginning." She talked for an hour. He listened the way he listened in the ring, cataloging not just content but texture, noticing what she emphasized and what she said with the particular flatness that meant it cost her something to say it. The parkas had not attacked randomly. They had responded to specific triggers. Motion toward the excavation site, sound above a certain register, light above a certain intensity. The initial casualties had occurred during the confusion of first contact, when the survey team had done what humans instinctively do when confronted with something enormous and unfamiliar: panicked, scattered, made noise. 3 team members had been injured in the first encounter. No fatalities. The parkas had not pressed the advantage. "They stopped," Reina said. "That's what I keep coming back to. They stopped. Once the team cleared the radius of the site, they stopped pursuing. They came back here and they've been standing there ever since." "Guarding," Miguel said. "Or waiting. Same thing sometimes." She was quiet for a moment, There's something else, Dr. Foley. He registered the name. The site director. He wasn't in the camp when the awakening happened. He was at the secondary bore site, 40 kilometers east. She paused. He radioed in to say he was safe, that he was sheltering in place, that he'd wait for rescue. And then, 6 hours later, the Parkas started bringing things to the edge of the excavation perimeter and arranging them. Equipment, instruments, specific components from the drilling rig. Miguel looked at her. Specific components, he said. The kind that, assembled in a particular configuration, would produce a resonance signal in exactly the frequency range that the awakening event used. She met his eyes. I have a geology doctorate and a minor in acoustic physics. I recognized what they were building after about an hour of watching them. It took me 4 more hours to figure out who taught them how to build it. Foley, Miguel said. The radio contact was him telling me he was okay, she said. It wasn't him telling me where he was. The thing about a double agent, about anyone who has gone over to the other side of a line that they once stood on the right side of, is that they always believe they have a reason. That was something Miguel had learned, not in the ring, but in the years before it, in the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, where the economy of loyalty was complicated, and people made choices that looked incomprehensible from the outside and made terrible sense from the inside. Foley's reason, as best they could reconstruct it from the data Reyna had accumulated over 11 hours of enforced observation, was that the Parkas were not simply an archaeological discovery. They were a culture. A dead one, preserved in ice, but a culture, with technology, with behavior patterns that implied social organization, with the specific kind of patience that implied they had been waiting not for rescue but for contact. Foley had made contact. He had found the frequency, and he had used it, and they had responded. And somewhere in those 40 kilometers between the primary and secondary sites, he had decided that this was more important than the people back at camp. That was the reason. You could understand it and still think he was wrong. Both things were true. He's going to wake more of them, Reyna said. The resonance device he's building, it's not a communication tool, it's a trigger. The same kind of fracture pattern that woke these 7, replicated at scale. There are more of them in the ice, Miguel. A lot more. How many? The bore data suggests a minimum of several hundred, possibly more. The Martian morning was turning. Through the airlock's small scratched viewport, the light was shifting from iron gray to the particular amber that the planet saved for the hours after dawn, the color that tourists photographed and settlers stopped noticing, and scientists measured, and what it actually looked like, in person, on a morning like this, was something between beautiful and lonely. We have to get to Foley, Miguel said. Through them. With them, he said. Or instead of through them, there's a difference. He went back out alone. Reyna wanted to argue about this. He didn't give her enough time to build the argument, which was a technique he had developed over many years, and which she recognized and resented, and nonetheless couldn't quite counter when he moved fast enough. He was back through the airlock with his helmet sealed before she'd gotten past the first full sentence of objection. The Parkas were where he'd left them. Still. Patient. The half-circle still open at one end like a question that hadn't been answered yet. He walked to the center of the open space, and he stood there and he waited. The nearest Parka, the one that had made the sound before, turned its head toward him. The movement was slow. Everything they did was slow, not from weakness, but from a different relationship with time. The way tidal motion is slow, the way the orbit of something very large is slow. They had been in ice for 80,000 years. A few minutes meant nothing. Miguel pulled off his helmet. This was not, again, what the Colonial Authority Protocol recommended. The suit's environmental systems would compensate for the exposure. The pressure differential was within manageable parameters at this latitude and altitude, but the protocol recommended helmet retention at all times during contact scenarios for reasons that were thoroughly documented and entirely reasonable. He needed his face. He needed them to see his face. He stood in the thin, cold air of Mars with his eyes open and his chin up, the way he stood in the ring at the start of a match, not threatening, not submissive, just present, fully present, here, and not going anywhere, open to whatever came next. The leading Parka made the sound again. Lower this time, different register. Miguel breathed through it. He could feel it in his chest, the way you feel a bass note in a closed room. Then he took 3 steps forward, not aggressive, not retreating. 3 deliberate steps, weight-centered, the kind of movement that was not a lunge and not a flinch, the kind of movement that said, I am coming closer because I intend to understand you, Not because I intend to fight you, and if those two things turn out to be the same thing, then we'll see. The parka was still. 7 feet of ancient patient mass, the parka it wore moving slightly in the wind like a flag of something that had no nation anymore. And then it took one step toward him. One step. Slow, the ice creak sound of joints that had been frozen for longer than any human civilization had existed, and were now again learning to bear weight. Miguel stood his ground. The parka stopped. They regarded each other across 3 meters of Martian dust. I need to find the man who is building a machine, Miguel said. He knew they didn't understand the words. He said them anyway because the act of saying them organized something in him, settled the argument he'd been having with himself about what he was doing out here. He's going to wake up a lot more of you, and I don't know if that's what you want or not. But if it isn't, if you're not asking for that, then I need to get to him before he does it. The parka regarded him with those amber-still eyes. Then it turned and walked east. After 3 steps, it paused and turned its head back toward Miguel, with the slow deliberation of something that has never been in a hurry and has no plans to start. All right, Miguel said. He bent and picked up his helmet. Lead the way. 2 parkas walked with him. The other 5 stayed at the perimeter. He had time, during the walk, to radio Reyna with the crawler's coordinates and tell her to get to it and start charging her suit and wait. She said things in response that he chose not to fully process because processing them would slow him down. He told her he'd call in every 30 minutes. She told him if he didn't, she would find a way to come after him that would embarrass them both. He almost laughed. The walk to the secondary site took 4 hours. The parka set the pace, which was not fast but was steady in a way that machines are steady. Not accelerating, not tiring, just continuous. Miguel matched it. He had trained his body for 40 years to endure specific kinds of punishment, and this was a different kind, not impact and resistance, but cold and duration, the long, slow arithmetic of distance. He thought about the film they'd watched together on their first trip. One of the old silent movies she'd loved, the ones where the hero was ridiculous and serious at the same time, and the whole point was that ridiculousness wasn't the opposite of dignity. She'd explained it to him once. The reason the old lucha films worked, the masked wrestler as hero, wasn't the mask or the wrestling, it was the stubbornness. The hero was outmatched and he knew it, and he didn't stop anyway, and that not stopping was the joke and also the point. He thought about that as he walked across the rust-red surface of Mars with 2 ancient things that had been dead for longer than his species had been building fires, he thought. Well, here we are. Foley was at the secondary site, as expected. He was a small man, pale and precise, the kind of scientist who moved through the world like he was writing it down in real time. When Miguel arrived, he was bent over a configuration of assembled components that Reyna would have recognized immediately, and that to Miguel's eye looked like something between a musical instrument and an engine part, intricate and purposeful and radiating an energy that the suit's sensors measured as a deep subsonic oscillation. He looked up when Miguel approached. His expression was curious before it was alarmed, which told Miguel something about where Foley's head was. He'd been so deep in the work that surprise had to fight its way through concentration to register on his face. "You're not Colonial Authority," Foley said. "No," Miguel said. "Who are you?" "Someone she sent for." Foley's gaze moved to the 2 parkas who had walked with Miguel and were now standing at the edge of the site in their patient way. Something complex moved across his face. Proprietary, Miguel thought. The expression of a man who has decided he discovered something and doesn't want to share the credit. "They brought you here," Foley said. "Interesting. I hadn't tested their escort behavior with an unknown subject." "I asked them to," Miguel said. "You." Foley stopped, recalibrated. "What do you mean you asked them?" "I stood in front of them and told them what I needed. And then one of them walked east and paused and waited for me. So I followed." Miguel looked at the device. "That's the trigger. It's a communication system," Foley said. "A way to reach the others in the ice, to tell them it's safe, to bring them back. Reyna says it'll fracture the permafrost over a 2-kilometer radius. Some disruption is inevitable. She says several hundred, possibly more." Miguel looked at him steadily. "And she says you know that." Foley's jaw tightened. He had the look of a man who has built an argument to an exquisite conclusion and doesn't want to examine the premises. They've been trapped for 80,000 years. Whatever happened to seal them in the ice, whatever catastrophe, they deserve to come back. They have the right to. "Maybe," Miguel said, "but not like this. You don't have the authority to." "No." Miguel agreed. I don't. He walked toward the device. But you don't have consent. Foley moved to block him. He was, as noted, a small man, not physically threatening, but his hand went to his belt, to a piece of equipment Miguel recognized as a geological resonance probe, repurposed, held like a weapon. I'll activate it now, Foley said. Right now, if you take another step. Miguel stopped. He looked at Foley. He looked at the probe. He looked at the two parkas at the edge of the site, who had been still this whole time, still in their patient, geological way. You made contact with them, Miguel said. You talked to them. However you manage that. Yes, Foley said, with the pride of it. Then you know what they want. They want to be free. They want. Do they? Miguel said. Or do you want them to want that because it makes you the person who gave them something? A silence. The Martian wind. The subsonic hum of the device, which was on standby, waiting. The ones at camp, Miguel said. They stopped. After the first contact, when the team scattered, they stopped pursuing. They came back to the camp and they waited outside the door. Not attacking. Not leaving. Just waiting. They were confused. They were waiting for someone to come back and talk to them, Miguel said. They've been waiting for 80,000 years. A few more days doesn't break them. What breaks them is the wrong kind of help. Foley's grip on the probe tightened. Miguel watched his knuckles. You're going to wake them all up at once, Miguel said. Hundreds of them, all at once, into a situation they don't understand, on a planet that's different from anything they remember, without anyone to tell them what's happening or where to go. That's not freedom. That's chaos. And chaos is how people get hurt. He held Foley's gaze. How many of your team are still out there? The probe lowered, not dropped, lowered. Foley was not a stupid man. He was a man who had gotten ahead of himself, which was a different thing. 3, Foley said quietly, in the secondary shelter. Okay, Miguel said. Here's what we're going to do. He didn't dismantle the device. That was the part that surprised Foley most, later, when he thought back on it. Miguel spent 40 minutes with the two parkas at the edge of the site. He stood near them, and he was quiet, and then he moved, and then he was quiet again. He didn't have language. He didn't have frequency technology. He had the thing he'd always had. The ability to communicate through presence, through the controlled intention of a body that had learned to be legible. What he communicated, as best anyone could ever reconstruct it, was something like, wait, not forever, but not now. The parkas understood patience. They had no choice but to understand it. When he came back, he told Foley that the device would be handed over to the Colonial Authority along with the resonance frequency data, that the archaeological contact protocol that the CCA had been drafting for 4 years and had never needed would be expedited now, and that if Foley cooperated and shared everything he knew, the discovery would still have his name on it. I want to be there when they make full contact, Foley said. That's not my call, Miguel said. Talk to the authority. And the ones at camp? They'll wait, Miguel said. That's what they're good at. Reyna was at the crawler when he got back, suit charged, thermos in her hand, the particular expression on her face that she wore when she had decided to let someone off the hook for something she'd also decided not to make them apologize for. She handed him the thermos without a word. He took a long drink of coffee. It was terrible. The reconstituted kind, the kind that existed at the intersection of fuel and punishment, and it tasted like the best thing he could think of. Foley, she said, recuperating. 3 of his team in the secondary shelter, unharmed. The device, standing by, not activated. He handed back the thermos. I need to call into the station. I know. She looked south, toward the camp, toward the 7 patient shapes at the edge of the perimeter. They're still there. Yes. Do you think they understood what you were trying to tell them? He thought about it honestly. The way you think about a match after the fact, not the outcome but the read, whether the read was right, whether the gap you saw was real or manufactured. I think they're very old, he said. And I think they've been waiting for someone to stop running long enough to have a conversation. And I think they're willing to wait a little longer to have it the right way. He picked up his helmet. Come on, let's go home. She didn't move immediately. She was still looking south. The amber light was going gold now, the way Martian afternoons went when the dust was low. Everything saturated, everything more itself than it had any right to be. Miguel, she said. Yeah, thank you for coming. He thought about the locker room in Guadalajara, the message on the phone, the specific weight of 11 words that asked him for the only thing she'd ever asked him for directly. 11 hours, he said. You held out 11 hours by yourself before you called. I had the chisel. You had the chisel, he agreed. You were fine. She looked at him with the expression that meant she knew exactly what he was doing, and she was going to let him do it because it was easier than the alternative, and also because he wasn't entirely wrong. "Let's go home," she said. The Colonial Authority Archaeological Contact Liaison Office was formally established 14 weeks later, Dr. Elena Foley was appointed as Technical Director of the Resonance Communication Research Division, a compromise that the diplomatic staff considered elegant and the field teams considered deeply typical of how these things went. The 7 parkas at the Meridiani site remained at the perimeter for 6 of those 14 weeks, patient as geology, patient as ice. The first formal contact session was conducted at week 7 by a team that included 3 xenolinguists, 2 acoustic physicists, and Dr. Reina Vasquez, who led the delegation and who, before the session began, stood alone at the edge of the site for 3 minutes without any instruments or recorders, just present, the way she'd been taught. The parkas had a name for themselves. It took 11 more months to translate it with any confidence. The best approximation the linguistic team arrived at was something like the patient ones, or possibly the ones who waited, or possibly. And this was the interpretation that the more philosophically inclined members of the team preferred. The ones who knew someone would come eventually. Miguel was in Guadalajara when the translation came through. He was in a locker room, different city, same configuration, and the message from Reina was exactly as long as the first one, 11 words. "They have a word for you. Come see what it means." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Pero, who was already reaching for the flask. "I'll explain what I know," Pero said. "It still isn't much." "It's enough," Miguel said. "It's always been enough." He picked up the mask from the bench and turned it in his hands. The fabric was worn at the edges now, frayed from years of use, the kind of worn that wasn't damage but was history. The record of every match, every fall, every time the gap had opened, and he'd moved through it before the moment closed. He put it on. He went back to Mars.